Welcome to one of the final sessions for today, a session on preservation and protecting art. We've had so many interesting presentations already today, and I am excited about the presentation we'll have this afternoon too. I'd like to preface introducing the speakers by just setting off the format for the afternoon, which will be parallel to some that you've already been in. We'll have a group of presentations followed by an opportunity for discussion among the group. And we've purposely kept time for that discussion among the group because, as you know, one of the hopes for this conference is that it is a catalyst for ongoing discussion, ongoing consideration of the issues that come up. And we want to take advantage of the expertise of all sorts that's in the room, the questions that are in the room, and provide time. So you're all on now. This is a session for all of us together. Before I introduce the speakers for this afternoon, I want to just read to you a couple of quotes from articles I read over the past couple of weeks. One from the New Yorker magazine, an article on the fire that destroyed the National Museum in Brazil. And in that article, the author talked about the Smithsonian as, and I quote this, an unparalleled collection of the national inheritance, talismans of our past, that are in many cases our only physical proof of who we once were and where we have come from. A thought that I think is useful to keep in mind as we think about issues of preservation and so forth. And I want to contrast, well not contrast, I guess just put along with a comment from Tyree Guyton that was in a recent newspaper article in the Detroit Metro Times, an article written by Lee DeVito about the show, about the showcasing the Heidelberg project at MOCAD. And if you haven't seen it, you'll have an opportunity at the party at MOCAD tomorrow evening, celebrating, among other things, that and the 32 years of the Heidelberg project. But in the article that Lee DeVito wrote, and it was about essentially that show, he interviewed Tyree. And as they were walking around the gallery, DeVito writes, Tyree points to a polka dot telephone booth in the gallery floor. He says, I retrieved that from the 1991 demolition. Heidelberg is here, he says. I thought, I'm going to save it because one day I'm going to be able to put it in a museum on display. So this is Heidelberg. He gestured around the gallery. This is all Heidelberg. And another comment, I think, dealing with the idea of preserving, carrying on, and the meaning involved, engaged in that. This afternoon, we have a really wonderful group of speakers who will address the issues of preservation and community from varying perspectives. I think perspectives that will be provocative of discussion and thinking among the whole group. And what I'm going to do is introduce each speaker individually. We'll kind of hold discussion until the end because I think these talks will interconnect in some very interesting ways and probably together will stimulate some ideas and some thinking. Our first speaker is Chris Taylor, who is the executive director of the Kohler Foundation in Sheboygan, Wisconsin. Chris has a BA in journalism and media studies from Northwestern. And she said, when I said, well, how would you like to be introduced? What would you like people to know? And she said, well, I'd like people to know that I'm on the lookout for important art environments in the United States and in Canada. So it'll be really interesting, I think, to hear Chris's comments on preservation and particularly on some of the projects that the Kohler Foundation is doing. It's a foundation well known for preserving and protecting art environments. So Chris, let's welcome Chris.
Thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be here. Recently, I had a conversation with a graduate from the School of the Art Institute of Chicago, and she's now a working professional, someone who I consider to be the next generation of the art preservation world. She's an advocate and a researcher of art environments, and she said something that stuck with me. We work in a small community. Today, I'd like to bring awareness to the larger piece of the preservation community, our impact. In particular, the impact art environments are having on our towns and on our cities, both culturally and economically. My hope is through this presentation, our panel, and this conference is that we inspire the next project and the next generation. Kohler Foundation believes passionately in the value of arts, education, and preservation. We enable access for cultural awareness, knowledge, appreciation, and the nurturing of creativity for generations to come. We were founded in 1940. The Kohler Foundation, located in Kohler, Wisconsin, has been engaged in preserving and protecting art environments and collections created by self-taught artists in Wisconsin and the United States for over 30 years. Our preference with environments is to preserve them in situ when we can. We identify potential projects and work with experts to understand the artistic, cultural, and regional merit of the project before we proceed, and we have a preservation committee that evaluates all of our projects and provides approval. We use outside curatorial support, and we rely on the talents of Karen Patterson and her team at the John Michael Kohler Art Center in Sheboygan, and we collaborate with art experts and curators from around the country as well. The most important piece in our preservation process is identifying a recipient, a steward, a caretaker, a not-for-profit organization or a municipality that will take care of the site in perpetuity. Our focus on preserving self-taught art began in the 1970s and 1980s with Ruth Kohler's vision to preserve vernacular art and environments created by untrained artists. Other like-minded people, including Lisa Stone, who's on our panel today, helped start a preservation movement that continues to build momentum today and grow. Here is Fred Smith's Concrete Park in Phillips, Wisconsin, a small town in the northern portion of the state. 240 concrete mixed media sculptures created between 1948 and 1964. He was a lumberjack, a musician, and an untrained artist. All the techniques Smith devised on his own. Kohler Foundation purchased the art and the property, and through partnerships restored the site and gifted it to Price County, Wisconsin. Now it's a community, 30 years later, thriving, operating much like a park, with the Friends of Fred Smith raising funds and overseeing preservation programs. One of the most significant projects for Kohler Foundation has been Passaquan in Buena Vista, Georgia. The colorful art environment was created by Eddie Owens Martin, known as St. Ohm. He created a 7-acre art environment consisting of 6 major structures, painted masonry, fences and totems, decorative walkways, sculptures, paintings, and other artifacts. Terry Yoho from the Kohler Foundation, as the previous executive director, led the restoration for the foundation, fulfilling the vision of the Passaquan Preservation Society and well-known folklorist Fred Fussell. Gifted to Columbus State University for continuing care, once preserved, Passaquan helped revitalize a downtrodden town, bring 100% of its storefronts back to life, create jobs, and spark educational programming and outreach. Prairie Moon Sculpture Garden near Cochrane, Wisconsin, a tiny town near the Mississippi River in northern Wisconsin. In 1992, Kohler Foundation purchased and restored the site with structural stabilization of the sculptures, surface repairs and cleaning, and paint analysis. The site continues to be a popular visitor destination. Next, Kenny Hill, a bricklayer by trade in Chauvin, Louisiana, was a recluse, but in 1990, without explanation, he transformed a lush bayou site into a fantastic chronicle of the world seen through his eyes. Later, he said he built it for the community. Excuse me. In 2000, we preserved the environment and constructed a visitor center, gallery, and studio. The site hosts a folk art festival, holds small exhibits, and through the site's steward, Nichols State University, offers multidisciplinary programs and student involvement. S.P. Dinsmore's Garden of Eden in Lucas, Kansas. Samuel Perry Dinsmore was a retired school teacher, Civil War veteran, farmer, lawyer, and populist politician. He began building the Garden of Eden in 1907 at the age of 64, using tons and tons of cement and limestone. Dinsmore's creation included an 11-room limestone log cabin home and 150 surrounding sculptures. Working with art conservators and a rotating team of technical assistants in 2011, it took over 5 months for us to complete the site. A small community of 300 residents is now an art-focused location in the geographic center of the United States, truly bringing the arts to rural America. Here's a miniature cabin before and after preservation at the Hartman Rock Garden in Springfield, Ohio. The town has had its share of misfortune over the years, from job loss to a shrinking middle class and population. It's a post-industrial community that has been kicked around for a long time, according to Kevin Rose, an historian from the Turner Foundation. This preservation project brought pride and hope back to the community. Some words that we're hearing a lot about today. With the revitalization of Springfield in 2010, an emphasis has been made on cultural tourism that draws on the city's history. Enter the Hartman Rock Garden. Built in the 1930s by Harry George Ben Hartman, it has 50 stone and concrete structures and countless handmade figurines. Kohler Foundation spent 8 months conserving the site, filled with castles, scenes of American history, miniature replicas of the White House, historic depictions, and more. The Springfield Foundation is the site steward. Kevin considers the Hartman Rock Garden one of the most unifying sites of any city in any state. He's a little biased too. Hartman has a large regional audience attracting visitors from Cleveland, Akron, Cincinnati, and is located near one of the busiest highways in America, Highway 70. When searching for top cultural destinations, Hartman pops up in good company with the Springfield Art Museum, the Frank Lloyd Wright Westcott House, and the Springfield Symphony Orchestra. Chris Schutte from the Springfield Convention and Visitors Bureau says people are drawn to the site from all over the country as well, expressly to see the garden. He gives Hartman credit in having an economic impact on tourism and with the revival of the city. Oh, you're so sweet, thank you. Chris told me that the Hartman Rock Garden is part of a web of the quality of life for Springfield residents. Hartman, along with Frank Lloyd Wright's Westcott House, is part of how people identify with our community, he said. He added that the garden is one of the great in situ folk art environments in the country, appealing to travel writers and bloggers. He says they're enamored. Hartman is our differentiator. It makes us unique. Kevin Rose summed it up. Hartman Rock Garden unifies so many different audiences. It's something no other community has. Groups are seeking out Springfield. He said, like Detroit, it's worthwhile to see the rebirth of a city. Hartman makes us proud. This is downtown Wilson, North Carolina, before and after. A story of a small town filled with Southern charm that was transformed from a tobacco-based economy to a more modern one. The five and dime stores of yesteryear are now the bones of modern loft apartments and boutique shops. Weathered brick tobacco warehouses are being reborn as businesses, restaurants, and apartments. Vala Simpson was a farm machinery repairman and a skilled creator and inventor. He began building whirligigs as early as the 1940s. Powered by the wind, these massive kinetic sculptures scale 50 feet in height or more. Up until 6 months before his death in May of 2013, he was building sculptures 7 days a week. By that time, he was famous. His creations had been featured around the country, and in North Carolina, he was attracting flocks of art lovers and visitors to the area. He was both stunned and tickled when his whirligigs were called upon to help save Wilson's ailing downtown. His rotating wheels, drive chains, belts, and shafts set in motion were to have a profound effect on downtown Wilson. Downtown stakeholders, artists, youth groups, neighborhood associations, and business leaders in Wilson galvanized to make it happen. A plan with the Wallace-Simpson Whirligig Park at its center was formalized in May 2010. This is an aerial shot of the downtown area at that time. Simpson's whirligigs are now being leveraged to help fuel an economic engine for job creation, tourism, and add vibrancy to historic downtown Wilson. Numerous organizations invested to fund restoration work on the whirligigs, including the NEA, slated for the park. Kohler Foundation came in to assist in 2016 and finished the restoration project. The numbers tell the story. Since announcing plans for the park in 2010, public and private investment was just shy of $1 million. Kim Van Dyke, Director of Planning and Community Revitalization for the City of Wilson, estimates new investment will reach $56 million next year. Private investment includes improving public property and parks, buildings, green spaces, streetscapes, utility upgrades, and parking, to name a few. Private investment includes construction, new construction, loft living, new retail, restaurants, coffee shops, breweries, art galleries, a hotel, and a bank. The downtown area is also home to a burgeoning arts community. Kim attributes the big visionary idea of the park as the catalyst to develop the downtown area. The annual Whirligig Festival, held in early November, celebrates the fanciful, wind-driven pieces created by Wallace-Simpson. The park features 30 whirligigs, a shade structure, and beautiful landscaping. From concerts to a farmer's market, there's always something happening at the park. Wallace-Simpson's creations are animating and rejuvenating the town of Wilson. The park is transforming the physical, social, and economic character of Wilson, its people, and inspiring a community. I hope you've been inspired today. Let's find the next project. Kohler Foundation is on the hunt for new, larger scale projects. So if you're familiar with an outdoor environment in your community or somewhere nearby, let's talk. Thank you.
One assumes that you're already in some conversation with the Heidelberg project. Thank you very much, Chris. It's inspiring to see the kind of work that the artists have done to begin with. They're such exciting and kind of human expressions, and so individual. It's exciting to see those, and it's also very exciting to see what the Kohler Foundation is doing to support and preserve those in communities. We'll have another look at some more art communities around the country with our next speaker. Lisa Stone from the School of the Art Institute of Chicago and the curator of the Roger Brown Study Collection there, and also teacher of theory and art history and criticism, will be presenting some of her work with preservation or about sites around the country. Some of those that are existing and active, some are in a period of transition, some have been lost. The Kohler Foundation has not been able to run in and save everything, and Chris is an expert on art environments around the U.S. and will present some, I can tell you, very interesting slides and work on some of those images. So Chris, thanks. Or Lisa, sorry.
Probably trying to learn break dancing at my age wasn't a good idea, but thank you for coming. I want to extend the sincerest thanks to Janine and her team for mobilizing an amazing gathering of thoughtful people from a range of fields, and of course to Tyree for the Heidelberg Project, what it started out as and what it's become and what it's becoming and what it's going to be. I first titled this talk Spare Change, Supporting and Defending Active Artistic Terrains. By spare change, I mean, how do we retain the critical element of continual change, which is at the core of artist-built terrains, and how can we be acknowledged, or how can change be acknowledged, retained, and mobilized in active sites? Because we're celebrating 32 years of the Heidelberg Project, and in thinking about how this whole conference came together and what the key points were decided upon, I was looking at the website of the International Coalition of Sites of Conscience, and I decided to talk about artist-built terrains of conscience, a category I made up. I mean, a title that I made up, but that the Heidelberg Project has exemplified for 32 years. I'm first going to present an environment that was sadly lost, then a few sites that are in transition, still functioning, but after the death of their builders, which is a tender time for places that the builder is integral to, posing specific and very vexing challenges to the custodians, and then a few examples of active sites, still in process and very much animated by their builders. Oh man, I had no idea this slide looked so terrible. But that is the Rosa Parks bus that Janine mentioned this morning, and sometimes when you move from Mac to PC, a little gets lost, but all the rest of the slides will be better. Thanks. Kia Tawana was an extraordinary woman, profoundly in command of her life and critically engaged in Newark, New Jersey's deep history and the post-riot rebellion landscape. Starting from scratch and building from the ground up, entirely with reclaimed materials on land she didn't own, her arc took shape. Oh God, that's okay, we're gonna see a video and this will be in it. This is humiliating. Her arc took shape and became a gift to the community, an active place of teaching and a tangible representation of hope, deliverance, survival, reparation, and healing on both personal and collective levels. And don't worry, you will see it. Well into her project, in controversies such as the Heidelberg Project has suffered and weathered over the years, the city of Newark demanded that the arc be removed. Kia resisted, and many people tried to help. And the process of resisting and attempting to save the arc became a community endeavor. When she lost the battle, rather than allowing the city to destroy this phenomenally original built structure, she took it upon herself, took it apart, and burned the wood. It was an example of the inability and refusal of people in power to understand how, to quote Janine, something experimental and messy can be sustainable and uplifting for the community, and how communities can embrace and support such work. Now I'm going to show a clip of a video about the Heidelberg Project at a gallery.
Like a lot of people, I had just heard since I've come to Newark that there was a woman in the 80s who built this huge arc on a vacant lot in the central ward of Newark. And I think what drew me to the project and made me think that more people would want to know about it is just that little snippet, is the actually not knowing, is how incredible that sounded, but how little I knew actually about what had happened.
She took like the wood from like the neighborhood and started building it. You know, that was the time of the riots or whatever, and things needed to be changed. I guess it just reminded me of Noah's Ark. You know what I mean? Like it was the beginning of something new.
What I discovered interviewing all these people, and there's hundreds more that I still have to talk to, is many people remembered the Ark and Kia very fondly, and I think we're often very grateful for a chance to reflect on their lives and to tell me about Newark, about their neighborhood, and it's kind of a chance to set the record straight.
We saw the art being built from the ground up. We didn't know what it was going to turn out to be. When Kia kept saying, I'm building the art. I'm building the art. We thought it was a little crazy, a little weird, and then it began to take shape. She built it all by hand, all by herself. Every dimension, every square, and when we saw the form really took shape, it was amazing.
I remember driving by, my father explaining to me how this crazy person is building an ark for the upcoming flood or who knows what. And at that point, it was just a keel. The whole area over there was fairly open and you could see what was going on. And over the whole 5-year period, I saw it become this 3-story, however, plus structure. It was neat to see.
Part of the reason why Kia was able to build the Ark was because so many buildings were.
You can Google that up and see the whole video. Artist-built terrains of conscience are often in transition, given the critical built-in element of change. Leonard Knight's Salvation Mountain, created out of pure love and incredible determination, is a splash of healing and hope in the desert south of the Salton Sea, one of the most seriously damaged landscapes in the country. Knight used Salvation Mountain as a platform for expressing the expansiveness of God's love in the simplest of reductive terms, with no thread of theology or dogma. Thousands of tourists and pilgrims flowed to the site and still do, and through the place, Leonard ignited a sense of community in the most open-ended of terms. Leonard was adamant that the site not be used by anyone else to express or spread conflicting agendas, which was happening before and also after his death in 2014. But the site is now managed by the nonprofit Salvation Mountain Incorporated that banded together from the area and that strives to adhere to Leonard's spirit and ethic. But there's an ultimate fragility to the site, which is vulnerable on many levels. The land is owned by the California Bureau of Land Management, which doesn't interfere. They don't really care about the place or the land around it. But they warned Salvation Mountain, Inc. not to try to buy the land because then they'd have to reinforce codes that the place couldn't possibly comply with, and they'd have major liability issues. The board president, Dan Westfall, said, "Leonard built this place in limbo, and we're still here." Noah Purifoy was a young artist in Los Angeles and was the first co-founder of the Watts Towers Art Center. Deeply impacted, you can go to the next one, by the Watts Rebellion and its aftermath, he and a group of friends realized they could no longer make art unrelated to the devastation and social conditions. So he made work exclusively out of the wreckage of the rebellion for years. Then he stopped making artwork entirely and switched to arts administration, and he worked for various California arts organizations and supported artists for most of his adult life. In 1989, he left Los Angeles for the high desert outside of Joshua Tree, California, and began a project animating and transforming about 17 acres into a completely hand-built landscape of tableaus expressing his beliefs and ideas, the Outdoor Desert Art Museum. Very much like the Heidelberg project, Noah's terrain is made out of ordinary stuff from the continual waste stream of consumer products completely transformed. Several tableaus, and this place is enormous, express memories of growing up in Snow Hill, Alabama, in a small house with 9 siblings. The object on the left, an outsized shopping cart, represents the condition of homelessness on a larger-than-life scale. Purifoy died in 2004, and the Noah Purifoy Foundation owns and manages the site, but with a light touch in that no one lives there, and it's very open and accessible for anyone who cares to enjoy or vandalize. When I was there a few years ago, these folks were there, and they described that they were just volunteers. They lived nearby. They'd show up every couple of days and rake the sand. They would repair guy wires. I shouldn't talk with my hands or Sean will change the slide. They attach guy wires because the site is subject to just a relentless wind of the high desert. So it's an example of a terrain of conscience that's kind of on cruise control, but also extremely vulnerable on a grand scale. Now I'll present a few sites that are actively being built and cared for by their builders who welcome visitors. I recently, after going to Springfield, Ohio this summer to see the Hartman Rock Garden and do some work there, visited Jim Boucher's Temple of Tolerance in Wapakoneta, Ohio, which completely blew me away. Boucher's plaque reads that it was built between 1994 and 1999, and it's very important to him that it was built in the last millennium. He states that it's a physical manifestation of a philosophical concept, more a state of mind than a place. And then it says, if you never met Jim Boucher when he was still here, he is standing right behind you. He's a part of that place eternally. Boucher uses the site, as a place for teaching tolerance and healing, especially with marginalized or underserved kids. And he tries to give them pride, confidence, and self-respect through engaging them in the temple. And this is a war memorial, and that central column is filled with one shell for every person from Ohio killed in any of the wars. And it's a really, really moving piece of a very, very extensive place. The site is extensive and rambling, and I can't begin to give a sense for the scope. But Boucher is currently seriously struggling with if and how it can transition past his lifetime and continue to function and retain his fundamental beliefs when he is no longer there. Pearl Fryer's project has roots in the blistering racism he encountered when he moved to Bishopville, South Carolina, and tried to buy property in what turned out to be a blatantly segregated neighborhood. And he was turned away and told point blank that he couldn't live there because he wouldn't take care of the property. Okay. He began his garden around 1988 by intuitively, and he says, cutting up shrubs, cutting up bushes, intuitively working with plants, and he had no background in topiary, and with very serious goals to regain his dignity and to create a garden, quote, that one can walk through and walk away with the message of peace, love, and goodwill. He also wanted to get Garden of the Month award, which they offered. Man, did that guy ever get Garden of the eternity? Pearl's message has radiated beyond his garden into his neighborhood and extended community and across art world and formal garden world boundaries as a life-affirming, truly inspiring creative work. It's kind of hard to believe. Actually, quoting Leslie Love this morning, she said, almost every environment like this, you go, whoa, someone built this, or in this case, someone did this. That happens all over the place. There's probably no site that's more impacted by change than a garden. When Pearl departs from the living, the site will be taken over by the Garden Conservancy, which seems miraculous to me since the Conservancy is known for its advocacy for very exclusive formal gardens, designed by designers, created by landscape professionals, and maintained by landscape crews. Fortunately, Fryer has time to outline the way he cuts up bushes with the Garden Conservancy and work with them about and tell them his wishes and how every single day they have to work on this garden. So I'm not supposed to, but I can't help mentioning Dr. Charles Smith in this brief discussion of artists who are actively building. Dr. Smith has worked since 1986, transforming home properties in Aurora, Illinois, and Hammond, Louisiana, into terrains of conscience, expressing the impact that the entire arc of African American history, from the diaspora to the present, has on millions of people, on society, and on his psyche. Unlike exhibits of objective truths in conventional history museums, Dr. Smith's sites express history as excruciatingly, truthfully rendered as he can. He makes streams of historical moments also created from the stuff of everyday life. Dr. Smith's work, which he'll discuss tomorrow with Janine, has significant parallels with the Heidelberg Project, especially in terms of their transformative power as passionately handmade sites of healing and survival that express just about every challenge that society can serve up, on monumental scales and micro levels. I'm sorry I didn't offer any answers to the major preservation questions, but I was hoping to articulate some of the critical issues and questions that communities can consider in how artist-built terrains of conscience can be embraced and supported by the communities for whom they were built. And as Chris's talk described, there's really no one-size-fits-all format, and many constituencies are necessary to devise solutions. And I have to apologize for giving these extraordinary artists such short shrift and squeeze them into 15 minutes. Thank you.
Thank you, Lisa. And thank you for doing so with a wounded ankle. I'm so sorry of you. Well, both your talk and Chris's talk, I think, have opened eyes to the great variety of these constructed environments and to the earnestness of the people, the artists who have created them, and really emphasize the importance of thinking seriously about how to preserve, how to protect what has been accomplished in these. We're moving into our third speaker this afternoon, who will be addressing the Heidelberg Project in large part. Dr. Jackie Taylor is the lead historian and cultural landscape specialist for the City of Detroit Planning Department, and has among her responsibilities designing innovative solutions for preserving and for activating socially and culturally significant buildings and landscapes. It's in the context of the larger environment of these art environments elsewhere that we look at the Heidelberg Project, and it's that sort of expertise that Dr. Taylor brings to this. She has a PhD from the University of Virginia in history of art and architecture, and has specialized in, am I saying this correctly, African American art environments. So she is, particularly well situated to help us make that link from what you both have discussed, Chris and Lisa, to thinking seriously about the Heidelberg Project. So without further ado, Jackie Taylor.
Thank you, Mame. That was an amazing introduction. And thank you, Janine, for inviting me to participate in this. It's a rare occasion that I have to straddle or present myself as actually straddling a number of worlds. I was formerly an academic, and as Mame said, specialize in African American art and architecture. Yes, there are such things as African American architects in history as well as today. But in my role at the city, I, as Mame also said, am charged with finding solutions to the large number of buildings that we have in Detroit that are vacant and need new uses and need to be brought back to life. We have at least 66,000 vacant buildings, including 43 schools, vacant schools that we, the city, own. And we're charged with, I am charged alone with thinking of how to save these buildings, because what happens when you tear down a building? You get a vacant lot. And what happens with that vacant lot? That's to be determined. So coming from the City of Detroit Planning Department, it's very interesting to be able to think about the Heidelberg Project. And I would just provide a disclaimer that all the perspectives that I'm going to talk about today come from me alone. They're not anything to do with the administration. I may not necessarily always agree with the administration, but they provide my paycheck, so I'm not going to say any more about that. But within this 139 square miles of Detroit, I find the Heidelberg Project to be a really fascinating cultural landscape, which I will try to explain a little bit about in a minute. So the Heidelberg Project, to me, is a multivalent art installation. It consists of individual objects, as well as those that engage the landscape, drawing it together in a natural quilt to reflect a symbiotic relationship between object and public realm. There are many and varied definitions of the Heidelberg project, depending on the positive or detractive perspective of who is doing the defining. It's a witty and whimsical, uplifting and positive environment, or it emphasizes and draws attention to the blight. And I hate to use that word, but it's the only word that people understand that means a vacant and poorly maintained building. But this blight is something that grates on the sensibilities of those who live its reality. Whatever the perspective, the Heidelberg project is an artwork installed into a residential neighborhood, a public work that speaks to shifting paradigms of a present reality and a future possibility. As public artwork that coexists with a residential neighborhood, the Heidelberg project is neither unique in or to Detroit. Although a unique expression itself, the Heidelberg project shares meanings that are amplified because they reside outside the white walls of museums and appear in places accessible to the public at large. These urban artworks have a power and political charge that can be breathtaking, disturbing, and educational all at once. Intended to cause an impact, public artworks often strike at the heart of issues that resonate with all kinds of people, both local and global, who see their own conditions and historical circumstances reflected back at them. When done successfully, the works convey messages that contribute to a public discourse that compels and challenges a response. Other such projects in Detroit can be seen in the work of Dabbles, an African-American artist who draws on the inherent nature of African artifacts to tell stories that connect seemingly ordinary material objects, landscapes, and humans to form a rich and dynamic understanding of the world we inhabit. Dabbles works with the typical materials of Africa, installing recognizable forms into the landscape and adorning existing buildings with colorful imagery that offer a layer of new meanings and significance. These works also coexist within a context of the residential quotidian. Even the more traditional art, such as works from the Detroit Institute of Art, and typically found within the walls of imposing public structures, has begun to find its way outdoors, with the hope that public engagement will begin to create some kind of connections across time and place, demonstrating that art of all kinds can be meaningful, aesthetically pleasing, and part of a pedagogical process. Other urban installations, such as Rick Lowe's Row House project in Houston, Texas, have been used to transform vacant buildings into occupied spaces that speak to community uses and raise awareness of the possibility for future activation, economic development, and preservation of a way of life. Building on adaptively reusing shotgun houses as art studios and artist living quarters, the Row House project has transitioned into a space of community activism that highlights issues around lack of resources that lead to the cycle of poverty in minority communities. But Tyree Guyton, I'm sorry, that's a little pixelated. Tyree Guyton's Heidelberg project has always been concerned with community, working in the tradition of the African-American artist to engage with social issues and use the materials available such as found objects. Guyton's work stems from a concern with the abandonment of local residents by those who are charged with their care. They raise questions about social justice, equity, and resistance. The question we're charged with today is how to preserve this work. But before I go into what kind of possibilities exist to preserve the work, I want to ensure that we understand that the work of Guyton has connected to a long history of development of the residential landscape. What I mean is this, that we need to recognize that the work on Heidelberg Street is simply another layer to the fabric that makes up community. Once this is understood, perhaps we can move into finding ways to acknowledge the residential community that has historically inhabited these streets, creating a landscape that is socially and culturally significant. Heidelberg Street was a significant part of the urban residential grid that made up the city of Detroit's east side. And this is a map from the Sanborn insurance maps that are available for every city in the United States. Although in 1894 there were very few houses on the street, it wasn't long before Heidelberg Street fabric matched that of other more dense residential streets, such as Berlin and Arndt. Heidelberg Street is here at the bottom. You can so if you're not used to seeing Sanborn insurance maps, these are footprints of the buildings that exist on the streets. And you can see further north of Heidelberg is quite dense. Heidelberg is still somewhat spotty, but by 1921, that's bleached out a little bit. Sorry, by 1951, The street boasted a number of substantial homes that had porches and garages in their large rear lots, and they were as dense as any neighborhood on the east side. In contrast to the 1950s, when Detroit had reached its pinnacle of the American dream, in which every employed resident had a wage sufficient to support ownership of a single-family home, the 2000s show a dramatic disintegration of neighborhood fabric, demonstrating the erosion of those possibilities. And it's unfortunately a little bleached out, but you can see the top row is the Heidelberg street, and you can see the number of gaps already appearing on that street. Just as the residential neighborhood has grown and retracted over time, so has the work that Tyree Guyton first began to build in 1986. Like the growth and decline of the city in time and place, Guyton worked across time, place, and generations, engaging his grandfather, artist Sam Mackey, to help him create his artwork out of the materials discarded by those who could no longer survive in a city absent of opportunity. Significantly, Guyton's work is completely embedded in this neighborhood fabric. It coexists with private spaces and the landscape that connects them into a residential community. Thank you. Guyton attached objects to transform residential fences, painted the streets, adorned the trees, and occupied the once inhabited spaces, transforming them from vacant lots. The work itself has also been transformed by deliberate and accidental interventions. Several buildings have been destroyed by arson. Others naturally caught fire, and more still have been destroyed by the city administrations, concerned with responding to residents' desire to remove the work from their community. But Guyton has nevertheless persisted in working with community to rebuild, expand, and nurture the creative spirit of those who relished his attempts to brighten the present state of a landscape that suffers from disinvestment. In other words, the Heidelberg project should be seen as a living cultural landscape that embraces the past as well as the present. The question is how to manage and preserve this multivalent cultural landscape for the future. Typical historic preservation tools tend to freeze historic objects in time so they can be saved for future contemplation and study. Cultural landscape preservation begins with a thorough documentation of the site, a contextual history, and an individual assessment that attempts to identify those areas of the landscape that have greatest significance for future understanding. This comprehensive approach typically allows for simultaneous development and protection. Such an approach might be considered a possibility at the Heidelberg project. However, the complexity of the Heidelberg project and its coexistence with residential fabric might merit an approach that has recently surfaced in the professional field of historic preservationists. This new approach, based in values theory, allows for a complementary set of strategies that can preserve living landscapes of culture and history. These strategies include economic development, acknowledgement of the real estate market, recreational practices and commemorative needs, stewardship of the natural environment, and physical responses to social justice or equity conflicts. This valued-centered approach tends more successfully to respond to social needs as expressed through cultural heritage, such as those inherent in the Heidelberg project. Values theory preservation practices begin with the assumption that there are many kinds of value ascribed to heritage in any given place at one time. Central to this approach to preservation and management is the question of who gets to make the decisions. How are the multiple management objectives achieved? How is the coherent plan for the inclusion of conservation interventions, visitor access, infrastructure development, interpretation, and residential privacy protection achieved? Rather than focusing solely on the art itself as a values-based management approach, attempts to balance and better integrate sometimes competing values can be sought after. Recognizing the value of the residential fabric as a significant historic component of the East Side urban grid and the contributions of those residents who lived and worked here, and provide for a flexibility that allows the cultural landscape to grow as it has over time and place, would suggest the possibility of a more successful preservation strategy. Stakeholders can be consulted from all areas of interest, including residents, art conservation professionals, real estate professionals, historical landscape preservationists, as well as recreation and interpretation experts. While including such a wide swath of individuals might seem excessive and overwhelming, it nevertheless offers an optimistic outcome for a broad constituency. Moreover, including a broad set of stakeholders deepens the richness of preservation strategies, as well as expands the universe of audiences and partners that can be enlisted to implement preservation strategies over the long haul. Guyton's current interest in transitioning the Heidelberg project to codify community involvement through making creative space available, education objectives clear and accessible, and signaling the separation of the art space from the residential space to ensure privacy could provide a greater acceptance of the project, as well as encourage long-term authentic preservation of its significance within the cultural landscape of the neighborhood. What if the preservation of this artwork could lead to a more engaged community support network that includes residents as well as administrative officials who begin to see the value of a project and in many ways reflects the spirit of Detroiters who refuse to give up in the face of adversity? A project that attempts through traditional African American methods to creatively highlight the plight of these citizens who are victims of forces greater than themselves, yet historically pay the price for those outside forces. If artworks like the Heidelberg project that are site-specific and rooted in local resources are not permitted to be preserved with as much attention to authenticity as possible, where does that leave us in our knowledge and understanding of history? And what message are we sending to those who have experienced the issues which prompted the initial creation of this site? Surely, as citizens of the world, despite how we may feel individually about such creative endeavors as the Heidelberg project, it is our responsibility to sift through possibilities and come up with an acceptable and positive preservation strategy that protects the human issues and sentiments the work expresses for future recognition and appreciation. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Jackie. It was a very thoughtful presentation with some very provocative ideas at the end. Let me just invite now for all the speakers to come up to the speakers table and to open this session for discussion. I think we've had some very interesting ideas put forward, a lot to talk about, and I hope that now we can take advantage as a group of what has been shared so far. Does this come apart? I don't know how this works. But, okay. There you go. Oh, thanks, good. Let me open this up to the group for discussion, questions, comments. Oh, thank you, Jackie. Janine.
Of course, because this is a session that I kind of personally designed because of where we are. And I just want to say first off that we are in a conversation, exciting conversation with Kohler to look at preserving works, individual works from Heidelberg. We are aware from Lisa that there are other sites around the country that have some preservation processes that are being put in place. And then in Detroit, we're looking at how we can begin to preserve our own jewels that are maybe new, and maybe there's nothing in place right now, but it certainly needs to be, because Heidelberg is not the only one. So once again, it looks like we're setting a precedent, and that's a good thing. But I think one of the questions, the first questions that I would ask of as we look at preservation strategies is how has the artist preserved the Heidelberg project for 32 years? And what do we learn from that? And that's one of those things that I think that sometimes baffle me when we think about, I have to go to a quick quote, please don't take offense, but when we won the EDRA Award, Environmental Design and Research Association, it was a unanimous decision, and one of the judges said, you could get a bucket load of money and a room full of government officials, and it wouldn't be nearly as good. I am saying that only to say that I think that what Tylee and the organization has done already deserves close examination about preservation. And I also think that the myth that we will satisfy everybody's concern within that space is unreasonable. And it'll never happen. Just ask the politician when they're trying to get votes. So how do we incorporate those kinds of considerations into our equation? Because I think it deserves consideration. Just food for thought. No answers necessarily, but thought.
Anybody would like to pick up on that?
Well, yeah. I'm excited by what I've heard today in this panel and others about how you're positioned now and what the goals are for Heidelbergology and Heidelberg 3.0. And it's also interesting to me as a preservationist to think about the challenges that you face, but I'm especially excited about and appreciate the many levels that you're taking into consideration, that you're studying the neighborhood historically and over a period of time. And also, you know, at the core of your program will be a deep awareness of Tyree and Heidelberg Project's soul and philosophy over time. I'll share an experience. Back in 1999, I was asked by Kane County, which is west of Chicago, Department of Development, to do a report on Dr. Charles Smith's African American Heritage Museum and Black Veterans Archive, because they wanted to understand it, have something to get their heads around, so they had a basis on which to preserve it. And it's like I've been working on site preservation for many years, and I thought, this is crazy. This guy's building, it changes every day. So I said, document, 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 and get the best videographers, get the best filmmakers, get the best everybody. Document Dr. Smith till you can't stand it anymore. and that didn't quite happen, but and I also did give them a report to outline the significance. But I think documenting the change over time and then understanding, as Jackie mentioned, how it is part of and came out of this place and this the community over a period of time, and understand that there's something, well, you have to define what you mean by preserve. And preserving no longer means locking in amber. Preserving means accepting change and accepting a place's part in its fabric, in its community, cultural, historical fabric. And I know I'm not answering the question, but putting some of the layers of what you're attempting to do around it. But it seems like everyone in charge is aware of those, and I'm not sure what the like hidden challenges or who's if there are forces that are resisting what you're trying to do. Let me guess. I know you can't say, but Mame, you can.
You know, one thing that occurs to me is, you know, we think of preserving something, we think of a thing. And you can protect it, you can put it in a museum, or you can, you know, somehow preserve that thing. But the Heidelberg Project is not just a thing. You talk about catalyst for change, you know, a medicine for healing. It's a verb. It isn't a noun. It itself is a changing thing, and as it does its work, so does the environment in which it works change. So there's this kind of constant, that round figure keeps coming to mind. There's this kind of constant articulation of change, and it never really settles, because as it's moved something, the something has also changed, and there's new work to be done. So how do you preserve, you know, how do you preserve a verb? It's one thing to preserve an object, but how do you preserve something that is constantly moving and in fact has its purpose constantly moving? Its purpose is not to be static. So in an ironic sort of way, we're talking about preservation, which kind of implies something that is static and safe and isn't going to change. And on the other hand, that thing that we're trying to preserve is constantly changing. So there's a kind of logical issue here, I mean, an issue of logic here too.
So we could be thinking wrong about it, I don't know. You know, honestly, as I really don't know. It's just a thought process.
There's a comment in the back. It looks like an insight has come.
Well, I don't know about if it's an insight or not, but I was thinking through this and I'll out myself. I'm a literary historian who also has a degree in library preservation. So
Uh-huh.
I've been thinking a lot about this, and the Heidelberg project is one of the places I just go all the time. And my preservation, my preservation professor, my advisor, asks us to use a heuristic all the time. Do you want to preserve it as is, as was, or as desired? And it occurs to me that, Janine, maybe your answer might be different than, say, the preservation community, where we would, I think, what I'm thinking historically, I want to document the entire process. I want to make sure there's a record of the whole story, and there's an archive, and it's audiovisual, it's artifactual, and we're keeping objects in certain kinds of conditions, and over time, some of those objects may be restored. But if I think about the Heidelberg environment and how much I love the snow there, and the line of hardwoods that are rusting out that had paintings on them, right? Now, do you know, an art conservator might be horrified by that, but I think it's important that the objects are in various states. This place feels to me a little bit more like a national park. And the living part of it has that quality to it. It won't be the same. The trees won't be the same 100 years from now, but there will be people who know how to preserve the nature of that site. And maybe that's a piece of the puzzle of how you deal with preserving the history of the project, which I think all of you can cope with, right? We can cope with objects of history and documents. And then preserving a living artistic environment where hopefully 100 years from now someone can walk through that space and feel something of what all of us feel right now when we go there. And those are different. And the intention that Tyree has built in that spot is something that you could develop as one preservation goal that's distinct from worrying about these other things, which in fact are settled questions. We know how to collect documentation. We know how to value. We know how to preserve objects of high intrinsic value. And there might be a fight or two, well, maybe this object has to come off the site and go into a museum. But that's kind of on the edges of things. But I think the gift the Heidelberg project gives to people is the equivalent of being able to walk into a forest and reflect. And it's the history of Detroit, working itself through and reimagining itself, and there's sediment of it there, and there's new growth, and I would really like that. I'd like to think that place could always feel that way. Whatever else you decide about the other things, and the issues are difficult because, people do live there, right? And that's also part of the ecosystem. Having to be next to a community. So that was just my thought.
That's really a lovely reflection. Yeah.
Dr. Taylor had a
Oh, sorry.
Sorry, I just wanted to respond to something that Lisa said, and also, I'm sorry, what was it? I didn't catch it.
That's Dr. Rebecca Chung.
Rebecca Chung. Nice to meet you. What you've both expressed, I think, are really significant aspects of preserving the Heidelberg project. Definitely documentation is critical because, as I tried to explain, and as you well know, the Heidelberg project has changed and grown and detracted over time, and capturing that essence is very important. So moments in time can be preserved visually through various new types of media. There might be aspects of the Heidelberg project that you have to do away with because it's in a residential neighborhood. I think it's also very important to connect with the community, engage with the community, involve them in the preservation, help them I'm sure there are people who would prefer it to go away. I know from my city connections that the politicians have responded to those people over time, and that's what their job is to respond to residents. So engaging the community and helping them understand the significance and the importance of this place and what it actually means for Detroiters, expressing their issues over time, because hopefully if we do our jobs in the city correctly, the city of Detroit will be a different place in 10, 20 years' time. But I think it's so important to remember the place we're at now and the place you have been in. So how do you do that? You preserve a record of the development of the Heidelberg project over time, the negative as well as the positive aspects. There are also ways in which you can create a living environment. I used to work, you mentioned the national parks. I used to work as a National Park Service consultant to preserve the landscapes. You can preserve landscapes even though they are living landscapes. You know, you can take part of the Heidelberg project and allow it to grow and disintegrate to some extent, to show the smells, to show the feel of the air at the time. There are all sorts of new devices. I'm from the city of York in England, and somebody who's from the city of York developed the ability to create smells. And if any of you have been to York, you have to go to the Viking Museum, because that was the first place where they created an environment that smelled like the city during the Viking period. You don't want to linger in there, seriously. But he has since gone on to create the smell of
That's big in historic preservation.
Yeah, that's huge. So, you know, the smell of tires burning, or the smell of buildings burning, I think, you know, could be a part of the Heidelberg project preservation strategy. So I think there are a number of ways in which you have to consider preserving. It's not just one approach, it's a series of different approaches. Engaging community, thinking about a living landscape, freezing parts of it in time for the record.
I think maybe just as a Detroiter, I think Detroiters get very attached to their objects, right? I mean, the spirit of Detroit, the tigers, it doesn't matter. Right? I think when something becomes iconic in Detroit, Detroiters get stunned about it.
I have a question about the big picture project that you're working with and dealing with, and I know there have been people who live within or in the vicinity of the Heidelberg project that are not appreciative of it and convey that. But as a city approaching preservation and support and advocacy for the project in various ways, are you also, and you said you're involving community members, are you also including within your plan a way to improve parts of the neighborhood that are not the Heidelberg project, or that might be within the larger scope of the footprint we saw this morning? But it would seem like because tax dollars are used and people should be considered, and vernacular houses, neighborhoods and so forth, part of a very important part of the cultural fabric. And I don't know if how to do that.
I'm not quite sure what your real question is, but first of all, I would say that the Heidelberg project does not fall within one of our, we have divided the city of Detroit into a number of areas that are considered relatively stable, and we are focusing on those particular neighborhoods as the most, having the most potential for regrowth. The Heidelberg project does not fit into one of those neighborhood boundaries, so we're actually not working in that neighborhood. But in the neighborhoods that we do work in, I actually spend a lot of time talking to community members, interviewing them, and getting their perspective on the neighborhood for the record, which is really fabulous because, you know, I get to know these residents really well. It's a very different approach from going into a large town hall type community meeting and engaging with residents as far as what the neighborhood plan hopes to achieve, what they would like to see it achieve. That's a very different approach from just sitting down in a room with a community member and hearing their story. So I think understanding individual residents' stories, their histories of living in this particular neighborhood contributes to an understanding of that place and would help preserve that place. I don't know if that's an answer to your question, but it's a segue.
What's unfortunate is that when we go into the communities to try and understand the stories of the communities, you're not getting the real stories of the community. You're getting a facade of a certain behavior that is very conducive to urban and poor community. Tyree and I give the real stories. And that's something that is not understood well. And another aspect of our journey that's not understood well is that there are a lot of people that are jealous and would never have a good word to say because it's not them. And there's an almost impossible way of truly balancing that. So, Jacqueline, for example, if you go and talk to a resident about what they want to see in the community, they're going to be on good behavior.
No, they are not. I'm sorry. I have been in many community meetings where people are very much on very bad behavior.
I
So,
understand that group setting is different, but I'm talking about really more one-on-one. I'm going to get a different reaction than you would get. And this is the dynamic that people don't understand about Heidelberg. Tyree knows the community, for example, in and out. He knows the names of all the people that live in that neighborhood. But if Tyree were a Caucasian man in that community, he would get better cooperation. And that's a dynamic that has to be explored within the African American community. It's been a dynamic that has been set up, unfortunately, though, by the institutional racism in the city. There have been people within the city of Detroit that said, Black people, you are not to like the Heidelberg Project through my actions of disrupting it or tearing it down. So we have been put at that disadvantage. And then we look just like the people in the community. So when you have that institutional racism in your mind, certainly you can't have the right answer. That is what we're facing. That is what we've been dealing with for 32 years. And we know it better than anybody else on the highest level. And it is our responsibility to work through it. That's right.
but
It's tough, but it's the truth. It's our responsibility to work through this issue with the people in our community that look just like us.
I wasn't saying that it wasn't your responsibility,
No,
but it's
I
a
didn't
large
cry about
responsibility.
it. I just-
No. I just want to set the record straight because there are two things I'd like to respond to there. One of my greatest mentors is a highly recognized African-American scholar. He is African-American, and I once said to him, do you think it's acceptable for me to do African-American history and do oral history, which I specialize in? And he said, you know, some of the best African-American historians or historians of African-American history are white people. So I beg to differ that I might not get the same story. I think it depends very much on the approach of the individual. But I'm not going to argue with you there. I think you also do have a responsibility, and you do know the residents very well. So I'm perfectly happy for you to be doing the documentation through oral histories. I think, you know, you might actually get a different story that might not also be accurate. So oral histories are never 100% accurate. That's something that we should all recognize, no matter who's asking the questions.
But I said it for a reason that I hope doesn't come off the wrong way. I think that what I'm really saying, the documentation, these things that we deal with, these things that we experience, I'm saying they're just the issues that we have to deal with. They're real issues, not who should be better at it, but it's the real issue. It's the way that people think. It's the brokenness of people, the way that they see themselves through my eyes versus your eyes. That institutional racism within the Black race is an issue that has to be dealt with head on, and it's not easy. It's very difficult, and that's part of the process, is what I'm saying. That's factored into the equation of what we deal with as we try to move this forward, if that makes sense.
Yeah, no,
So
I agree entirely with that,
I just have
yes.
to put it out there. Do you understand what I'm saying?
Yeah.
It's just real.
Yeah.
No, I appreciate it. And because you will have, you are the bridge to make that connection because you see it openly. So your ideas are so valuable and bringing all those aspects together. I just want to say, like, the words that come to my mind hearing the discussion is that Heidelberg is not necessarily about the answers, and Terry is, like, I think what draws people continually back and says, so what is it about this little bubble? I've been there, I felt it, I spent a day there, I completely felt the atmosphere, and I think what people come for and what has to be preserved is not only the art, which is part of the aesthetics and the atmosphere, but what has to be preserved is the atmosphere, is connection, and a place that people can ask questions of themselves and of each other. And it's not necessarily about answering those questions, but having a place that they're heard and explored, either internally or interpersonally. And that is what is preserved. That, through the art community that's going to be built there, I think it's amazing. As an artist, I'm like, wow, that's incredible, tremendous. It's that place that people can go for questions that will keep people continuing to keep it alive long after the future.
It's interesting that this conversation on preservation, saving, conserving, like I think it was Eugenie who talked this morning about the circle and the 3 parts and peeling off layers. Now all of a sudden we're talking about something different. We started with something that was a kind of outward appearance, really, and how to deal with that or save that. And all of a sudden we're down to issues that are really fundamental to human nature, I think. And we're talking about this at a time there's a great divisiveness in our country. And somehow we're talking about how to preserve the integrity of that kernel that joins all of us. And we're identifying issues that separate us. Issues around, there are different ways of thinking about preserving. I mean, I think probably everybody in this room has an affinity toward the Heidelberg Project, wants that project recognized and preserved, whatever that means to us, and it probably means as many different things as there are people in this room. And how we go about that in a way that keeps us all together, and we find a core that is that kind of rich core of humanity. That's what brings everybody to the Heidelberg Project. The Heidelberg Project destabilizes us all. We don't quite know what to make of it. And we search for ways, and part of it is we talk to each other because there are other people there too who are destabilized, and they may be very different from ourselves. And it's the environment itself creates that interaction. And I think when we're talking about saving the Heidelberg Project, I mean, we're talking about that interaction. We're not talking about a particular thing that is really, could be there or not. It isn't that thing. Though I picked up in the conversation today, I think it was something that Tyree had said, is that, that things catalyze action, and so things, it's not that things don't count, but it really is in some way that the things don't count, because what really after is something else, and the things are part of a vehicle for getting there. So I think this conversation is reaching levels that are really, that we don't often get to in a group conversation.
It comes back to humanity, doesn't it?
Doesn't it?
Yeah.
Doesn't it?
That
Energy.
Yeah.
It comes back to, ultimately, it comes back to our humanity, and the things just become the tool, the vehicle that brings us to these discussions. Place of soul, place of conversation. And it's scary to be honest, and, because we don't want the conflict or that, so it's scary to say, why do you feel afraid? Why do you feel jealous? Is it, maybe there's cultural understanding in deep roots that I need to understand. You're just coming from a different perspective.
It's very, very deep. I mean, I know that you guys must understand, we want to share with you, that when they were beating this Do you understand what I'm saying? So you have to, it's like that mentality has been perpetual in generations. And it's so hurtful. And it's so, it's degrading. And it's hurtful. It's very, it takes time. It's like the story I told with the guy who happened to be a heroin addict, got dressed, washed, and came and stood before people who don't look like him. And somehow in his mind he said it was okay. That's the beginning of the change. It's a long process because you're undoing so much damage. And that's what's not what I'm saying, Jackie, and that wasn't directed to you, it's just in general. It's not factored into the equation of how we move our communities forward. We don't know how poverty taxes the brain or how mistrust has taxed the brain. And that's unfortunate. That's a hurdle that we have to still address. Very much.
It's a hurdle we have to address together, I think.
Yes. And that's why it's important to say it in front of everybody. You know, and I think that we've got to have real honest conversations about what is happening within our own race as well as the various races, and be honest about it. It's healthy. It's healthy.
It's not only healthy, but really necessary.
It is. I'm sorry I'm so passionate, but I am.
To your credit.
Part of the issue is scale, right? If we have one controversial work of art, say a painting or a sculpture, it can go in a museum and people can argue about it, right? It's a cross and a beaker of urine, whatever it is. And museums are places that both permit and contain controversy. It is a safe space to be transgressive. And the Heidelberg Project is doing that transgressive work, right? As well as the formal work and the beauty of the artifacts, but the whole statement is also transgressive. And so people's reactions are strong, and it's not inside it's not siloed
It's
in
not
a museum
contained.
space. It is out in the world, which is part of the point. But all of the issues that would, aggregate even around one controversial object, it's a similar project, but the scale is multiplied because it's in a living space. It's it's connecting with non-artistic spaces, and people are just having their feelings, but which has happened with every controversial work of art that's ever been made. It takes about 100 years for people to kind of settle down about it, And that's great, except Janine, you got to do this now.
But I would actually argue that once those 100 years or however long it takes for people to settle down about it, that's when the critical aspect of the work of art has died. So in order to, you have to keep that work of art alive so it keeps generating that discourse. Because otherwise, what's the point?
Well, I don't think that. I mean, there are plenty of works that, the point will live past 100 years. There won't be riots.
Isn't the
There
point?
won't be riots every time the Rite of Spring is performed, but
Well, there are various levels of reaction, but what I think is so powerful, and maybe that's what's being expressed today about the Heidelberg Project, is that it incites some kind of visceral response. And when it stops doing that, maybe we've gone beyond, and we've reached the point that Janine is suggesting we need to get to at some point, but maybe then we won't be as enriched.
Well, we have 2 minutes left to wind all this up, to resolve this. And I'd like to kind of give an opportunity to anyone on the panel who has some kind of winding up words that you'd like to share.
I don't see, with everything that I've heard today and everything I know about the Heidelberg Project, that you're going to turn it into a petting zoo. I think it's going to, I can assure you that it's going to continue to be alive and on the wild side.
Any other comments from the group? Well, I just want to thank you all. I think everybody has been a part of this. So thank you very much to the presenters, and thank you to all of you for your thoughts and contributions. Give yourself a hand.